Hi class, in this video I'll be going over correlational research and experimental research. So in correlational research, it is a relationship between two or more variables. To break this down, a variable is a term used by researchers that means something that varies between individuals, which may increase or decrease under certain circumstances. And these variables may be correlated, meaning that there may be a relationship between two or more variables. As one variable changes, so does the other. Correlational research is a type of non-experimental research that describes the degree of a relationship between two variables and examines whether those two variables are correlated. And an important aspect of correlational studies is that correlation does not equal causation. And correlations often have confounding variables. This means that a variable may be related to another variable, but that does not mean that one variable causes the other variable to occur. And then a confounding variable is a third variable or other explanation that may influence the relationship between our two variables of study. For example, there may be a correlational relationship between Harry's knowledge of magic and his ability to perform wand spells. As Harry learns more about magic, his ability to do spells increases. But we can't say that Harry's knowledge of magic caused his wand spells to be better. The reverse might be true. He could have practiced his wand spells more, which increased his knowledge of magic. So the reverse may be true in correlational studies. Also, there may be confounding variables that explain this relationship. A confounding variable in this example could be that Harry's studying could be a confounding variable that influences the relationship between his knowledge of magic and doing wand spells. Therefore, it could be Harry studying that increases his ability to perform wand spells and not his knowledge of magic. Another example is procrastinating and knowledge of psychology. The more you procrastinate, the less you'll know about psychology. Procrastinating may hinder your ability to know more about psychology, but procrastinating may not be the sole cause for your decrease in knowledge about psychology. The reverse may be true, such as the lack of knowledge in psychology makes you procrastinate more. Or there could be a confounding variable, such as working a part-time job, which may influence your knowledge of psychology. Therefore, it could be working a part-time job that hinders your knowledge of psychology. A correlation is measured through a correlation coefficient, which is denoted in stats as R, as you see here. And a coefficient is a number between -1 and 1 that indicates the strength of the relationship between two variables. Accordingly, the relationship between two variables can be positively or negatively related, and they could have a strong or weak relationship. If the correlation coefficient is closer to 1, then that relationship is positive. If it's more toward -1, then that means it's negative. And the closer the coefficient is to 0, the weaker those variables are. So let's say that one of our correlation coefficients is 0.90, then that would be a strong negative correlation. A positive correlation is when variables move in the same direction. So as one variable increases, the other increases, and as one variable decreases, the other decreases. Whereas a negative correlation is when variables move in the opposite direction. As one variable increases, the other decreases, and as one variable decreases, the other increases. For example, in our previously told example, as I shown, if the correlation coefficient between Harry's knowledge of magic and his ability in wand spells is 0.80, then that relationship would be a strong positive correlation. This is because the coefficient is closer to 1, so it's a positive correlation, and this means that the more knowledge Harry has, the better he will be at doing wand spells. Remember that as one variable increases, the other increases as well for positive correlations. And then, if we were to run a correlation between procrastinating and knowledge in psychology, and say the correlation was negative 0.90, then that would be a strong negative correlation. This is because the correlation coefficient is closer to negative 1, as you see there. So it's stronger and negative. This means that the more time students procrastinate, the less that they'll have in the knowledge of psychology. And then remember that a negative correlation occurs when one variable increases, the other decreases. Researchers often use scatter plots to graph what a correlation looks like. Similar to your previous math classes, there's always a x and y axis. And each variable goes on either axis. So for example, if we were measuring studying and final grades, each variable would go on one axis. And we would have to figure out if there was a positive, negative, or no correlation between the variables. As you can see here, this would be a positive correlation, such as the more studying you do, the better the final grade that you will receive. Let's see if you can figure out the second one. So the more you procrastinate, the less the worse final grade you will receive. As you see here with the graph, it has a negative correlation here. And then this one, if we compare shoe size between final grades, this has no correlation, and these two variables do not relate, as you can see with the scattered dots all around, not forming a clear positive or negative slope, as you see with the other two examples here. And then moving on, well, here's some examples of the correlation coefficients. So if studying in final grades was 0.94, this would be a positive slope. If it was negative 0.89, this would be negative. And something like 0.13, which is closer to 0, would be a non-correlation. It would be a really weak correlation between shoe size and final grades. Illusionary correlations are false correlations. These occur when people believe that a relationship exists between two things, when the relationship does not. And these correlations are essentially illusions that people construct, which often develop stereotypes, biases, and personal experiences. For example, there's a common saying that pit bulls are naturally dangerous and vicious due to discussions from word of mouth, visuals, or the media portraying these dogs as vicious, when that statement may not be true. And then there's confirmation bias, which is the tendency to actively search for information that supports people's existing beliefs, theories, or bias while ignoring information. People often search for information that backs up their own previously held beliefs. It is a lot easier to confirm your own belief than to think about how a person may be wrong or incorrect. When viewing or reading media, people may have an adverse reaction when their views or beliefs are contradicted. Whereas it would be beneficial for people to take that information into consideration. This allows individuals to test their knowledge and beliefs and allows people to learn and change. And I think it's especially important in the world that we live in now, when we could look up information with a push of a button, or go on social media apps, viewing opinions and fact among true or fake news. So it's really important to be able to decipher information, and that we should acknowledge that there are different biases, and that we have our own biases in which we should be able to check according to the multiple perspectives that are offered, and not just looking at our own perspective or our own bias. And then moving on to experimental research. Up until now, we've only discussed research methods that can test if there was an observational or correlational relationship between variables. These previous methods have all been non-experimental research, but we could use experimental research in order to find a cause and effect relationship between variables. And experimental research uses the scientific method in order to find that cause and effect relationship. This is the same figure that I explained in the previous videos. When researchers want to test a theory or have a general question, they do so with a hypothesis. And we could answer hypotheses through observations and correlations. But again, they don't establish a cause and effect relationship that experimental researchers can provide. When designing an experimental research design, we want to establish an experimental group and a control group. An experimental group is the treatment group, which receives the treatment or the variable of interest being tested, whereas the control group is the group that does not receive the treatment or any variable of interest that we want to test. Researchers are then able to compare how the experimental group differs from the control group, and thus we can determine if the treatment group was different or not compared to the control, and this gives us certainty that the treatment worked, and we're able to determine cause and effect through this research. In this example, let's say we want to answer the question, do students get better grades when they study? We could try to answer that question through a hypothesis that proposes how we predict the students will result. And when writing a hypothesis, it's really important to be precise in how we predict the group's results. So first, we start with the experimental group when writing a hypothesis, and we might want to say, if our research question is, do students get better grades when they study? We might want to start off with participants who study in order to establish that we are interested in people studying as our variable of interest. And then we want to predict what will happen to that variable of interest. So perhaps we hypothesize that those who study will be more likely to get a better grade on the final exam. And now we need a control group to compare our experimental group to. So we say compared to those who don't study. And hopefully you see the different chunks and parts of how to build a hypothesis. So we first start with our experimental group. So participants who study will more likely get a better grade on the final exam. So we're predicting how the experimental group will result. And then we want to compare those to the control group, or those who don't study. So we have this as our example of our experimental group, those who study versus those who don't study. And then we want to operationally define what studying and not studying is. And how do you think we should define those characteristics? We might define studying in our experiment as reviewing notes for 1 hour in the lab. So we might have our participants come in to our lab and just review their notes for 1 hour. whereas our control group and people that we bring in for the control group who don't study, they don't review their notes, but say they might do a filler task. But even though we have two groups and that we defined our variables, there could still be issues that arise that limit our future cause and effect results, such as experimental bias. This is the possibility that the experimental's expectations skew the results of the study by directly or indirectly influencing the participant. So let's say that when we're planning the study, we want our participants to naturally perform how they would without any influence from us. We might not want to tell the students directly that we want to split them into groups, and this can prompt them to want to study more often than they usually do if we tell them, or they could lie and just report that they studied when they actually didn't. And there could be many direct and indirect ways a researcher can influence participants to behave and respond in a certain way, when in reality we want to test their natural behaviors that occur in the real world. So instead we could use a single blind study, meaning that participants are unaware of which group they're assigned to, but the experimenter knows which group they're in. So before our participants come into the lab, we tell them we want to first test them on several tasks, and when they come into the lab, they're asked to enter a room not knowing which group they're in, or even that there are two different groups. But we, as the experimenter, knows. Or we might want to do a double-blind study in which both the participants and us, the researchers, don't know which group the participants are assigned to. We may want to just send them into the room with a folder that has their notes to study in, or a similar folder with the filler task inside. But the researcher doesn't know which folder they're giving the participant after the study. This way, both the participant and the researcher doesn't know which folder the participant will receive after they complete the 1 hour in the lab. And then this way, this minimizes both the participants and the experimenter's biases that may change the participant's natural behavior. And by doing these blind studies, we were able to eliminate the placebo effect, which occurs when people's expectations or beliefs influence or determine their experience in a given situation. If a participant expects that they're being tested on their study habits, then this might influence their results. And then after we have our hypothesis, we want to split our groups and manipulate our groups. And this is what we call an independent variable. An independent variable, or IV, is the variable that is being manipulated or controlled. And when we create these separate groups, we're doing so in order to test our variable of interest, which is the dependent variable. And the DV is the variable that is being measured. A way to remember the difference in the names of each is an IV is called an independent variable because it is separated into several independent groups, whereas the dependent variable is being changed and being depended on how the independent variables or independent groups respond. And then in our example, our IV would be studying, so we split the groups between those who study versus those who don't study. And then what do you think we're measuring for our dependent variable? Our dependent variable would be measuring performance on the final test. So we would split the groups between those who study versus those who don't study, and that would be our independent variable. And we want to test their studying performance on the final test, and that would be our dependent variable. That's what we're going to be measuring. So now that we have established our IV and DV, we need to fill people into these separate groups for our independent variable for our study. And we call these people participants, who are subjects of the research. A lot of research uses college students, but they may not be representable to the entire population. Most college students have an age range between 18 to around 30, which obviously doesn't represent the entire population, so this could be an issue. But college students are among the easiest to recruit for study, which really helps experimenters. Then we should always randomly sample to gather participants. This means that researchers are gathering a subset of the entire population in which every person has an equal chance to be selected for the study. Random samples are preferred because if there is a large enough sample, researchers can be sure that the subset or sample is being representative of the entire population. And we want our sample to be representative of the entire population so that the results and characteristics of those people that we sample are representative of the entire population. So then researchers can conclude that the result among these samples occur as well within the entire population. And then after we gather a random sample, we want to randomly assign our sample into groups of our independent variable. Random assignment means that all participants have an equal chance of being assigned to either group of the independent variable. So each participant of our sample will be randomly assigned to either the group that studies or the group that doesn't study. And then random assignment is very important for research because it makes it unlikely that there are systematic differences between each group. We want the groups to be fairly similar in age, in ethnicity, and so on and so forth. And the only difference between our groups is the one group who studies and the other group who doesn't. So the only difference between our groups is the difference that we want our independent variable to be. Here's a graphic example of what random sampling and random assignment looks like. So we have our two groups that we established, those who study and those who don't study. And then these people represent the entire population. But we want to pull out a random sample from this entire population that accurately represents the entire population. So we do that. The red are the people that we randomly sample out of the entire population. And then we want to randomly assign participants to each group. So say this person will go to those who study, the next person will go to those who don't study, and so on and so forth. And then here's the general flow of how we would randomly sample and assign groups. For the same example, we'll be randomly sampling 100 participants. And out of this random sample, we would randomly assign 50 of our sample to the experimental group of those who study, and then 50 to the control group of those who don't study. And then we want to measure their performance, or the dependent variable, on their test results. And here are some challenges with experimental research. So as I mentioned before, for the researcher, we could have experimental bias. And a solution to this is to have blind observers, either a single or double-blind studies, or having placebos. And then another problem is ethnocentrism, which is just one ethnicity that we're focusing on. So it's really important for cross-cultural sampling when we want to sample research participants. And then some challenges with the participants is they can have bias. So we want to get a random sample and randomly assign our participants to each group. And our participants can also hold biases, and a solution to that is for them to remain anonymous, confidential, incorporate single and double-blind studies, or placebos. And then after we gather our data from our two groups based on how they did on the test, we used statistical analyses in order to find out if there are significant differences between people who study versus people who don't study. You'll learn more about creating experiments and conducting stats in your research methods and stats classes. But after stats results are conducted, researchers observe their findings and interpret them. They often compare their research with research similar to theirs in order to compare and contrast their findings. Similar to how I mentioned in the first video, how research is cyclical. And after we observe observations from our study between those who study and those who don't study, we could reform a new question or new theory and test a new hypothesis related to this first theory. And then once we find out our results and we want to publish our results, researchers have to comply with the American Psychological Association guidelines when publishing in these journals. And one requirement is for these publications to be peer-reviewed, which means that people in the same field of study are randomly chosen to read your research, and if you want to publish and determine if it's sufficient, they have to review the article and then let you know if any changes need to be made before publishing your results. Peer reviews also ensure replication, which means that the experiment is described well to be able to replicate the study if another researcher wanted to redo it. Sometimes researchers who replicate a study want to add extra measures or extra questions to the previous study. So say we want to publish our example study of those who study and those who don't. We would have to send a written article of our experiment to get peer reviewed, and then they would assess if our methods are able to be replicable. Peer reviews also are looking of how reliable and valid the research study was. Reliability refers to the ability to consistently reproduce a result, and then validity refers to the extent to which a method or measures accurately measured what is supposed to measure. A peer reviewer reviewing our experiment will want to make sure if there is the ability to produce the same results if the study was conducted again. And then they would want to see how valid our study was by determining if putting people in separate rooms to study or not accurately reflected their performance on the test. So they would assess how replicable it would be, how reliable it would be, and the validity of our study. And then that concludes the correlational and experimental research. In the next video, I'll be going over ethics, and I'll see you guys then. Thank you.